Another traveler. Pull a chair up and rest your feet. Would you care for some food or a drink? Perhaps some information or a legendary tale. Come, stay a while and listen.
Hello, welcome to Tavern Legends, episode 4 of Tabletop. I'm Clayton Friedemann.
And I'm Jacob Youngboy. Today, we're going to be talking to you about the role of a dungeon master and how to prepare for your first game. So the points we're going to cover, first we're going to talk about what the dungeon master is and your job. We're going to talk about the tools you will need to run a session. We're going to talk about preparing for your first game. And then we're going to wrap it up with what we call a session 0.
That is correct. I'll get us started off here, kind of introducing what the Dungeon Master is. You may hear it referred to as a DM throughout the rest of this podcast. Just know that we're calling the DM a Dungeon Master. There's another term that some players use around the table called Game Master.
Yeah, and you might hear that in other games more often. Dungeon Master is kind of special to Dungeons and Dragons.
Yep.
It's not exclusive, though.
No. So that's where Game Master comes in. It's for everything usually outside of Dungeons and Dragons, but...
GM.
Mm-hmm. So, what is a Dungeon Master? So, a Dungeon Master, or a DM in Dungeons and Dragons, your main job is to get a group of players together and run them through the world that you present to them. Essentially, you are... I don't want to say the god of the world, but in a lot of ways you are. You control and dictate how the story flows and everything like that. You choose where the players are going, what they're going to be doing in the future. And
to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, yeah. You put the players in situations where they can, succeed, fail, move on, adventure further. There's a whole plethora of options. But as the Dungeon Master, your main duty and job is to, be behind this screen, respect your players, and let them play in the world that you're kind of dishing out to them.
Right. You're presenting a story that they get to interact with.
Mm-hmm.
This is by no means yours exclusively. It's something to share.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that's important. You almost act like a diplomat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're in the middle of the fray. You're acting like all the characters that the players are talking to. You're the shopkeeper. You're the bartender. You're the lowly maid that's tending to the queen. You're the squire that's tending to the knight.
Or you're the big bad evil guy.
Or you're the big bad evil guy. You're essentially you encompass all those things, all those interactions that the players have with anything in the game. You kind of abjugate and decide what happens based off of what they roll and how they interact and everything, and you kind of decide how that progresses the story forward and how that kind of makes the world step back and react as a whole to what the players just did. Is there anything you really want to touch on otherwise?
I think it's just good to remember that You do run the game. You're supposed to be familiar with the rules, but your best laid plans will probably fall apart. So be ready to improv. That's important too.
Definitely be ready to improv. Your players will always throw some curveballs at you. Within Dungeons and Dragons and in tabletop role-playing games in general, I would say the Dungeon Master is the most important role in the group. They're going to take on the most responsibility, to say.
Yeah, and you can't play without a Dungeon Master.
Correct. So that's kind of a little bit about what the Dungeon Master is as a whole. It's complex, but simple at the same time. You're there to move the game along and make sure everyone's there having a good time.
Right.
So now that we've kind of introduced a little bit about what the DM does at the table, let's kind of talk about what their job is kind of as a whole.
So in terms of the game, your job is going to be running encounters, which might be combat, or it might be a social interaction with the guards,
Right.
any random activity that is based on the players trying to succeed at something.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of interactions that might just happen from player to player, so you don't need to really worry about judging what happens there unless things become a dispute. Then that's where you come in as the rules master and arbiter. You have to decide in the end who's right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something to be prepared for, and that's a pretty big job, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. So what kind of things are you going to need as a DM?
In terms of tools on hand, you're going to need a homebrew or pre-written quest, however you want to do it. We would recommend a pre-written one if it's your first time, simply because it takes care of a lot of the work, and you just have to familiarize yourself with the information instead of trying to put together all these random pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And you can always choose parts from either one to make your own to get a special flavor for yourself. You're also going to need a rules guide, which in our situation, we are using 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and a Monster Manual. And those 3 books are the core.
Yeah, those are the core rules.
That's going to get you through just about any game. And it's going to give you a lot of options on what to make for characters, but also what to use as monsters. And it covers a wide range of what you will need.
Right, and I would say the DM's guide and the monster manual is what typically resonates to the DM more. The player's handbook is obviously in the name, and we went over that in our previous podcast, episode 3, which you guys can check out. But, you know, the DM's guide is essentially going to be filled with tools and explanations of how to run the game and how to fit into the game, what kind of players you want in your game. It's going to go kind of through step by step and kind of explain to you and slowly unfold back like what it's like to put on the mantle and become the DM.
Right. Our guide does cover a little bit of the same pattern. We just cover it a lot quicker. So you could use this in conjunction with the DM's guide if you would like. Yeah,
this is definitely just for, you know, new people kind of just looking to get out there and wonder what it kind of takes to be a dungeon master. And you guys don't need to think you need to be a grade A actor. You don't need to be
Mercer.
Yeah, you don't need to be anyone super special.
You don't need to be Perkins.
Yeah, you just need to be able to run and organize a game and make sure that your players that are in your game are there to having a good time. And that's the most important thing, really.
Right.
That everyone at the table is having a good time.
Yeah, I would say that's pretty accurate.
So that DM's guide, that kind of ties into that. It kind of brings you in and shows you how to maximize your role as the DM and make sure your players are happy, make sure your world is full of surprises and intrigue and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah. To wrap up this list in terms of what you'll need, I'd say probably the most obvious thing, players. You're going to need somebody to play your game.
Of course.
So we touch on this briefly in the player's guide. We'll talk about it again here. Finding players can be challenging. We've had our fair share of issues just trying to get people to stay in the game too. But if you're going, we got the benefit of, we've had a group of friends that's typically been playing the game, and we've just had to add a couple people at a time as opposed to getting a group from scratch. So I would say you're going to have to be a little bit flexible in who you accept to your table. And I think you're just going to need to make sure you communicate like what kinds of things might cross a boundary with you. Like maybe there's certain topics you don't want to discuss in your game, or there's certain things that you do want to explore in the game and other people might not be comfortable with. So those kinds of things you're going to want to talk about in advance when you're trying to find some players, just a little bit, at least so everyone's on the page when you're getting together.
Once again, can't hit it home enough as the DM. You want to make sure everyone is having an amazingly fun time at your table.
I mean, I would caution, it doesn't have to be amazingly fun,
No.
but ideally that's what you want.
Yeah.
I would say as long as they're getting engaged in your game, I would say
Right.
you're doing something right. And you can build off of that.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to get some feedback. I tend to ask my players, or at least Clay, after every game, like, did you like it? What did you like? What did you not like? So I can take that into the next session a little more prepared.
Yep. Come ready to take notes. Come ready with notes already written down. These are all things you're going to need. We didn't even mention a whole plethora of options. There's battle maps you can use. There's miniatures.
Yeah, I would say another thing right there, in terms of what you will need, it depends on what kind of game you will be running. If some people call it theater of the mind, which is just, it's more you just rely on your imagination. And some people like the tabletop feel of actually having a board out and you measure out the squares and you have combats on a grid. So,
Very tactical.
so that may change what tools you will need to run the game. Obviously, if you're going to run a board game, you're going to need the board to do it. So some sort of grid that you can use.
They have grids or hex boards.
Yeah, there's tile pieces and stuff like that. So that will be another tool you'll probably want to run your game.
It's not necessary by any means to have all that extra stuff, and it can get a little expensive. We've definitely put our fair share of money into Dungeons and Dragons, but we love the game, so
Right.
and that's kind of what we hope that you guys achieve, listening to our podcast and everything. So hope you can get out there, be a good DM, and learn these things. No DM's perfect. Don't focus on that. If you focus on that too much, you're going to get in your head, and your players are going to be able to tell if you're miserable behind that screen or if you're having a great time. They'll know.
My best sessions have typically been when I just said, screw it, let's just play some D&D. And my worst one was when I felt like, okay, this all needs to be perfect. You got to do it just right.
Right.
So just be ready to play.
Yeah. So, I mean, that kind of wraps up, what you're going to need, what the DM does in the game. And so now we're going to kind of flow into preparing your game and what that kind of takes to get it going.
So, Clay, let's talk about preparing your game.
Absolutely. It's the best part and the most important part as a DM.
Absolutely. It's really exciting to come forward with a whole open option of what am I going to play, what am I going to present to my players. So the first thing you're going to need to cover is these core assumptions. You'll find these in the Dungeon Master's Guide too. So these 5 core assumptions are basically underlying every D&D setting. So these will kind of take out some of the guesswork in terms of picking a setting. These will be answered already. So there are gods that oversee the world. There is a world that is considered untamed or wild. The world is ancient. Conflict shapes history, and the world is considered magical to a certain extent. These 5 ideas are the governing logic behind most decisions in a D&D setting.
Right. And we say assumptions, but that only means, like Jake said, they're not permanent.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have these 5 rules. But that is the basic outline for them. So if, in terms of deviating from this, there's already an example in Dark Sun. That world is not magical because the magic has been drained from the world. And that's what makes it a unique setting. The rest of it still kind of falls in line. It's an ancient world, it's untamed and all that. But it's not magical. So you can use these core assumptions to also define what makes your game unique.
Exactly. Like, is it, like Jake said, the Dark Sun setting, which takes place in a desolate desert area? Or is it take place in the dark vastness of outer space? These are all sorts of questions that you can definitely, you'll be asking yourself and what kind of game you want to run. And typically, you see the high fantasy setting in Dungeons and Dragons.
That's pretty common.
But like we said, those assumptions are there for you to mess around with, but also to kind of have a general understanding of how the world works.
Now let's talk about tiers of play. The tiers of play in D&D are based off of this idea where you transition from being basically a commoner to a near demigod. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole range of level 1 to 20.
Mm-hmm. Which is where D&D takes you through those levels 1 through 20. That's pretty much the base. You can go a little higher than 20 if you want. It gets a little crazy and out of hand.
Yeah, it's not... 5th edition is not designed to go above level 20, so you will be stepping into homebrew territory.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, tiers of play, there's, like Jake said, the first one is kind of, you're starting out as a hero. No one really knows your name. You're coming to this town to leave a mark on it, or there's some sort of binding event that's going to happen that puts you in this town where you are essentially, by the end of this tier, you're going to be the hero of that town. That's kind of the
location.
Yeah. It's kind of a very small area. I would say that's levels like, what is it, probably 1 through 5?
Yeah, 5. We'll say 5. 1 through 5 as a good, I would say, folk hero. You take on a local role, maybe a sheriff who happened to save the town, or maybe you saved a child from the mine, that kind of stuff. That's going to be more of your low-level stuff. You're not going to face too many truly dangerous challenges. Nothing that's going to be threatening a kingdom, for example.
No, but it's definitely something that's threatening you or a town or a local business, something in that kind of range.
You might tease hints at what is to come, or even like reveal that the big bad is designed for like level 20 encounter, but they don't have to face him right away, that kind of thing. Pull a little Final Fantasy right there.
Yeah, or maybe your whole campaign takes the entirety of just that tier.
Yeah, so that'll be something we cover is in terms of scope. But so level 1 through 5 is our folk hero. Level 6 through 11 is the next tier, which would be more of a regional hero. You might start saving a larger town or helping several small villages, that kind of thing.
Maybe getting a little bit more involved in the political power in a town.
Yeah, the governing and how more than just one person's life is impacted. And that also brings with it more dangerous challenges. Traps will be more threatening. This is this tier where you start to actually see resurrection magic, if you choose to allow that in your world. To spells like Revivify, which can bring people back from the dead. This is also the tier where you start to see some of the iconic spells of D&D, like Lightning Bolt or Fireball. So this is kind of, I would probably say like a favorite tier of mine.
Right.
6 to 11 is that sweet spot where you really start to get a lot of your core features, a lot of the cool powers that can really change the world, but not earth-shattering yet. So I would say this is pretty manageable in terms of how hard it can be to run.
Yeah, and
it's still a little more complex than low tiers, obviously.
Yeah, and as a DM, you definitely start opening the book a little bit more and what you can do in this tier. And that's where each tier gets a little bit more complex.
Right. You might be starting to explore creatures from another plane at this mid-tier here, the regional hero. And then the next tier, which would be basically 11 to 16, maybe up to 17. This is where you're starting to get to be heroes of the kingdom kind of idea.
Right. People know your name.
And your name travels from town to town, and people have heard about your exploits, and you have typically a good amount of wealth accumulated, or you have contacts and like people to rely on.
Yeah.
You've typically been traveling for a while at this point.
Yeah. Adventuring is a second nature.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah. And then our last tier, 17 to 20. This is the epic tier. Most games do not get up to this point. And when they do get up to this point is when real shenanigans happen. Because this is where you start getting spells like Wish, where you can literally wish and change the world. And so that can dramatically change how a game will be played out.
Or bring a person back to life without needing any material substance of their being.
Yeah, or even just wishing somebody away. Mm-hmm. That boss doesn't exist anymore.
So this last tier is definitely where the book is wide open for the DM. This is where they're, choosing the biggest, baddest enemies, the strongest plot lines that are intertwining this world and these characters together. Usually, it's a lot of fun, but it's definitely a lot of work.
Mm-hmm. It takes a lot more planning because you have to be prepared for so many different abilities that could change what will happen.
Yeah, it's not like level 1 where your players can't charm the guard with a spell and steal everything in the store. We're at level 17. They can charm an entire town or a store or a bar, and
they could just earthquake the town and it's gone.
Yep, exactly. There's a definite change of power, and you will feel it change as the DM, and you'll have to kind of adjust to that.
Yeah, you have the ability to grow with the game, which is what I really like about D&D.
Right.
And that the tiers of play helps reinforce that. You start from this basic understanding of adventuring, and you build on it, and you build on the skills that you get, and you build on the story that you're traveling through, and you get items, and it all just builds up to a high tier of play.
Right. And that high tier play kind of goes into the next point that we have, which is, we had mentioned the assumptions, gods oversee the world.
Yeah, this is something that's pretty important to keep in mind for when you're preparing your game, because especially in most of the D&D settings, gods run the world. There are multiple deities out there, and people are typically polytheistic, so they don't just believe in one god and only their god. It's like maybe you worship Gaunt and Melora, or like that'd be kind of a weird mix.
Right. And all those gods are laid out in the Dungeon Master's Guide, at least the majority of them.
Yeah, there are other settings, obviously.
As well, yeah.
Yep, and you can find, most settings will have something related to the gods described out for you. Mm-hmm. So like the Forgotten Realms, in the Sword Coast Guide, there's a list of the deities and kind of their role and who might worship them and how they interact with the people. Then, I mean, it's a nice way to just use somebody else's pantheon. You can go through and make your own if you want to. Mm-hmm. It just gets a little more complex. I would say if you're going to try and make your own, maybe some sources of inspiration might be like Greek, Norse, or Hindu.
Yep. And those pantheons exist. I can't remember if they're in the player's guide or in the DM's guide, but they do list some of them in there. So yeah, I think the DM's guide. So if you want to play like a Romanesque style game, those Greek mythology and those kind of gods are in there. Yeah. Those Norse gods. It's really cool, and obviously you have if you have the creative ability, you can make your own, like Jake was hinting on. So
right.
But gods are definitely important.
Yeah.
Especially if you have divine characters.
Yeah.
Or, a religion is a huge driving point in your campaign.
And you mentioned divine characters, which touches on another good point, that they get their power from a god in terms of magic. So, like, how does magic play into the world? That's another important point to consider. Is there restrictions or special styles that have to be mastered? That kind of philosophy.
Mm-hmm. There's a ton of magic in the game, and we've definitely touched on a little bit of it. We've touched on some low-level stuff, some high-level stuff. But as the DM, it's going to be, your job to go through and decide what types of magic you want to include in this game. Are there some you want to restrict? Are there some that you maybe want to modify because you don't like the way the spell works? All that kind of stuff. These are all questions you're going to have to ask yourself going into the game. And Jake had hinted on it earlier with some pre-written quests. A lot of that stuff's already laid out for you, and that's kind of coming together with all these points that we've been hitting on and preparing. That's the good thing about the pre-written quests, and they already have all the stuff kind of figured out. You just got to read it and familiarize yourself with the source material within.
Absolutely.
But of course, the chance to create your own game, your own style, and your own world all lie within the book too, and you can easily do as a DM I mean, I wouldn't say it's easy by any means, but
You can. You have the tools you need to do it.
right.
So that covers, I would say, the basics, like the rules that govern your world. So we have magic, gods, it's a wilderness, like maybe you have a few places in mind. So how does that tie into your campaign? This is where you start to be maybe thinking about a map in terms of where are we going, or what does the region that you're playing in look like. So this is also where you're going to want to start to consider about the scale of your game,
Right.
how many levels you're going to cover, and how much distance you're going to travel, and how many locations you want to go to. Maybe you're playing in a game where you just have one major city, and you just go from the major city and you go back and forth to adventuring locations. Your map's going to be pretty small. Your scale of game is probably going to be pretty small too. Or you might be doing one where you're traveling the entire Forgotten Realms. We kind of talked about that with one of our previous quests, the one that Clay wrote. We traveled through pretty much the entire Forgotten Realms. I mean, the only areas we didn't really touch was the Southern Reaches. So we traveled through multiple countries, and we had big battles in entirely different areas of the world. So that would, I would say, a big scale of game and a large map. So
And yep, once again, all that stuff's in that DM's guide. It gives you charts. It gives you
locations,
tables. Yeah, tables.
if you need a random location or
Examples.
a random encounter.
And the DM screen also worth mentioning now. That has a lot of good stuff on it too behind the screen if you like to use that.
Yeah, some DM screens are better than others. I would just say, in terms of a DM screen, you're just going to see like what rules are on there and what things you use the most. It might be a little hard figuring that out on your first try, but they're not that expensive. You can always get another one, and you can always put in, if you really want to, you can always make the little place cards and just tape them on the inside of your screen. So, switching back into preparing for your game here, we touched on real briefly, like if you wanted to play from one central city, so we need to talk about settlements and the role that settlements play in your world. This is something that's probably going to be one of the biggest factors in terms of what your players feel, because they're going to be living in these settlements.
Yeah, you want to make sure you can bring them to life. You want to make sure that you can put them in that setting and make them feel like they're there as best as you can.
You're going to need places to explore. You're going to need important people. You're going to need a lot of names.
You're going to want to be describing things that they see, things that they smell, things that they hear, things that they taste.
Yeah.
These are all
cover the senses.
These are all this is your duty as the DM to let the players know what they're experiencing, like we said earlier. So that all ties into that definitely for sure. And that comes in big into the settlements.
Yeah. And you're also going to want to consider in the settlements, like, what is their culture like? What is the society? Maybe they're monarchy. Monochromatic. They could be monochromatic too.
Yeah.
Or they might be a democracy. Maybe it's Athens. Maybe it's Rome. You just need to...
Maybe it's a group of barbarians that have no sort of rule or anything. They just... The strongest one rules.
Are cities built in treetops? Are cities built in mountains? Are cities built at the bottom of the sea? So you're going to want to have a picture in your mind of what you want to achieve in terms of what the settlement is, and then you're going to try and project that out for your players.
And, that's going to break out into a whole bunch of different other questions, like... Are there any factions or organizations that are living in this settlement? Maybe there's, some sort of evil entity in this town that wants to take it over that is living underground that you don't know about initially, but you discover and learn as you play through the game that they in fact want to rule this town and throw over the current rule that's in place.
Upset the balance. Yeah. So factions, organizations, the languages they speak, the religions they have,
right?
Who has the money, who has the influence,
their mannerisms, their personality, all that is going to come to life through you.
Yes.
And also the players interacting with you.
Yes.
It always helps.
I would say we're talking about all these points, and I want to caution, you don't need to necessarily have all the answers before you start your game.
Oh, no. You will never have all the answers. I mean...
Right. So you might actually find it beneficial to, like, if you're in the middle of playing a session and the players decide to go to the docks and you hadn't figured out anything at the docks, you can come up with something on the spot, or you can even, like, ask the player, what are you looking for? Oh, I'm looking for a fisherman. Great. Now there's a fisherman there at the docks, and we're going to come up with his name. Plenty of times where I ask the players at the table, like, what's his name? I don't know. What's a good name? And that's how we get characters named like Lim Biscuit.
Yep. And let your players, be included and enjoy in that fun, because they're there building the story with you. So they're a powerful tool for the DM to utilize for sure. Yeah. It's
not DM versus player. It's DM with player.
Mm-hmm.
You're just more of the information.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and we
don't be afraid to get help.
We do got to say it. There are some groups out there that will have a different mindset. Maybe they're a tyrannical DM and they just want to kill everyone in the party, and it happens.
Well, and some people like the more, I could say, dangerous appeal of it. So I would say we have a very friendly outlook on D&D and more embrace of the actual team play aspect of it.
We're there to relax. We're there to story tell with each other. We're there to have fun with our best friends and just come together and have 5 hours of fun, like once a month, twice a month,
depending on how lucky we are.
So that's going to be your job as the DM. Is this player fitting in? Are they toxic? You're going to have to make those decisions. You're going to have to talk to your players and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, and then that's also going to affect how they interact with the world that you have set up. So if you have a toxic player who just keeps trying to kill everybody in the world that you took time to build...
Murder hobo.
Murder hobos. They might not be the right player for you. But if maybe you get a player who... they have 100 ideas for people they know. Just start taking those characters that they made in their background and just throw them in a town. Mm-hmm. You don't have to do all the work on your own.
Mm-hmm. And it's typically easier to rein a player in when they're at a lower level. And if they're not having a good time with the game, I would say 9 times out of 10, they'll approach you and let you know. It's not a bad thing. It's just sometimes people don't mesh. And that's just the reality of the world we live in.
Yeah, and I think that'll come up in session 0 a little bit, we'll touch on that soon. But switching back gears to preparing for your game. So we've talked about your core assumptions, like campaign plans and mapping, to scale a game, making your cities, factions and organizations. So let's talk about your starting point. So where you're starting for your game. The first thing you're going to want to do is decide, is this a home base or is this temporary? Because that's going to impact how you play the rest of the game.
Right. Then once you get that starting point kind of figured out, set the stage up. Play it up like this city's really important and you're going to be spending a lot of time here. If it's not that big, set that stage, set that bar like, oh, it's just a small little shanty town. No one's around. You're passing by. Rats scurrying across the town.
Yeah,
right, kind of thing.
The more you describe a place, the more the players are going to interact with it. So if you intend for them to be there for a short amount of time, don't make it interesting.
Yeah, right. And unfortunately, sometimes those non-interesting points do draw in players. People do get distracted by them, but that's just the nature of the game.
In that case, you can come up with something on the spot. You can go to a table and roll to see if there's something there, or you can just simply tell the player, there's nothing interesting here. It's just some farmers.
And that kind of ties into the next thing here, your characters, their background, and their involvement. Depending on who they've made your players as characters, they're going to react to situations differently depending on how they're role playing that character. Maybe they're bakers and they walk by a bakery and they decide to just have a little mini quest where they pop into the bakery and you have a little bake session with the guy there.
Yeah, and
bake
to
session.
the rest of the players, to the rest of the players at the
smoking weed.
table, they might not find it too interesting. But one of the aspects of D&D is that team play. So letting somebody else have the spotlight for a moment to build their character, I would say it enriches the experience as a whole.
Right.
And then on that note, you're probably going to want to, probably like decide what backgrounds are allowed, how involved are the characters in your world, and what classes and races are even allowed. So this is a good time to figure out what is allowed from a player standpoint.
Yep, and how they're going to fit into your world and in a kind of a smaller little way there. So after you kind of get that whole starting point and the stage set for your characters, you're going to need to essentially know where your campaign is going next. Is it going to keep taking place in this town, or is it going to move on to a next one? And that's going to tie into how you're tracking time. Like, what season is it right now? How much time has passed between the travel of these two towns? Was there maybe an event that happened that shook up the world? Maybe there's now a giant chasm in the middle of this town that you used to stay in, and 3 years have passed, and you guys have slowly rebuilt this town over time.
Right. The story might become, how do we live around this chasm in the town? Campaign events, there are many ways to plan out your story. I'd just say find what works for you and use it. My case, I tend to use, you might see it in some of the actual quest books, but it's a basic bubble diagram where you have your starting point, and then next bubble over is the next event. Next bubble over is event 3. Sometimes you might have a little branch off where a couple options can happen. But that's the basic method that I use to organize my sessions. Mm-hmm. And then from there, I'll fill in the events that happen in between. And I might have to change the bubbles later down the list because something changed at the start.
Right.
That's why I don't want to do too much detail later on in the game. Focusing more on what's the next few sessions.
Yeah, and chances are, unless you're like a good group of friends like our group tends to be, you're not going to necessarily know your players right out of the gate. You might know them, in which case you might know the play style. Like we had mentioned earlier, murder hobos. Maybe your group is that way. So, hey, have a campaign where you guys just kill stuff all the time.
You could be villains.
If that's what you want to do it. If you want a group that is role play heavy, where every session is them getting really into character and portraying that life, hell, more power to you. That's your game. You're going to want to find those play styles. And as you keep playing with your players, you'll learn their play styles. You'll be able to put the pieces together to build the group that you want, to have the campaign you want, and the players that want to be part of that campaign and interact with it.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, is there much more we should really touch on here, or do you think we've got a pretty good idea of it? Or?
I would say you mentioned world-shaking events. Mm-hmm. I would just say, be careful in how often you use them. You don't want a world-shaking event to happen every couple levels.
Yeah.
Why are we even living here in that case? But they can be a good way to really drive the story. Mm-hmm. And then I'll also say this touches in with play style more so. A flavor of fantasy. I mean, are we talking sci-fi? Are we talking Tolkien?
Dusk Noir?
Yeah, or like, do you want to do a Sherlock Holmes game? Like, you can.
Mm-hmm.
The D&D has that available for you. It's just something you're definitely want to figure out before you go into your session 0, your play style, and the flavor of the play.
Yep. And that kind of pretty much wraps us nicely into our next points, session 0. So a session 0 in Dungeons and Dragons is essentially after everything you've done as the dungeon master, you have gotten your game planned, you have gotten your players together, you have figured out what game you are running and how you are going to run it.
You have all your tools, you have a place to play.
Mm-hmm. And you're ready to essentially bring your group together and talk about all these rules with your players. That's essentially what a session 0 is all about. You're going to introduce them to what the campaign is going to be. You're going to maybe make characters at the session 0 or go over what kind of characters they want to be and how they're going to fit into your story. It's a very important thing to run a session 0. We typically have gotten away from them just because our group's a little more experienced and we play with the same people for the most part.
Our session 0s bleed into session 1.
Yeah.
This is also where, personally, I like to do events that bring the players together.
Right.
So, like for my Storm Kings game, I had a little intro part for each character separately, so that basically they all had a reason to be approaching Baldur's Gate. They might have been doing it all for separate reasons, but they all showed up at the same time, which led into the next event, and that just kind of, they all got roped in together, and they've been together ever since.
Mm-hmm. So the session 0 is really important in that, and where you're going to need to discuss what you're going to be expecting as a DM from your players, and what your players should be expecting from you. It's a two-way open, conversation.
Yeah.
Between you and your players, where you're just figuring each other out and where this game is going to be going.
Yeah. So you will want to cover, maybe not as thoroughly as we discussed here on the podcast, those points from before where we're talking about gods and settlements and that stuff.
You're going to want to keep some secrecy to your world. You're going to want to be able to surprise the players.
I would say you're going to want a few highlights from each one of those points, and that is what you present to the players. You don't want to present too much and have an information overload, and all of a sudden, especially if you have new players, like, oh my goodness, how am I going to deal with 50 pages of information? No, I would not hand out 50 pages on your first session and tell your players to read it and expect them to know it. Mm-hmm. Like, at best, you could have your 50 pages of stuff, set it on the side, and just tell them, if you want to read it, you can. I have this information here. I will tell you the critical things that you need to know and that your character knows.
Mm-hmm. And this session 0 also gives your players a good moment to think about their next move and how this campaign is going to affect them. So it's important for them to kind of introduce them into that world and get their wheels turning in their heads.
Yeah. This is maybe more of what you could call a min-maxer approach, but that might influence what class you pick, what race you pick. Like, if you know that you're going to be hunting demons and undead, a paladin might be pretty good. Mm-hmm. But if you know you're going to be facing a bunch of anti-magic creatures, then maybe that wizard isn't a good idea.
Right.
So some things like that, I would say optimizing the play. It's good to know what you're getting into for that type of player. Mm-hmm.
I would say that pretty much sums up session 0 pretty good.
Szechuan 0.
Szechuan 0 sauce. And once again, we just want to hit on that point where, as the DM, you're leading these players. They're looking for you to be the responsible one and get this game together, put together, and then run them through it. So make sure you're listening to them. Make sure you're attending to their needs, and make sure they're also listening to you and respecting your authority in the position that you're in. It's a two-way street. It's a give and a take.
You don't want to rule with an iron fist, but you can't let them walk all over you.
No, you gotta know when to say no. You gotta know when to say, oh yeah, let's give that a try, and your players will feel rewarded, or some might feel a little spiteful, but you'll find the balance as you keep playing. And like we said, there's no such thing as a perfect DM, so don't ever stress out over that. You're going to be doing the best that you can. Yeah. And that's all the DM mantle is, essentially, is leading these group of players through a collaborative story, or whatever you decide to come up with. I mean, is there really anything else that you can compare it to or have to say about it?
I don't think so. No.
Yeah. So I guess with that, we will sign off from the podcast. We appreciate you guys listening once again. You can follow us on Twitter. We just changed our name to Tavern Legends Podcast, but we are still at Tavern Legends. And once again, on Facebook, you can find our page, which is Tavern Legends. And we'll be definitely looking out for anyone who wants to ask us any questions, or if they have any concerns about D&D, we're there to answer them for you.
Yes, sir. We are here for your D&D needs. We are also going to be looking at starting some Dungeon Masters Guild content soon. We will have more information on that as it becomes available.
Yep, and we definitely want to let you guys know our last two podcasts, episode 3 and episode 4. This one was episode 4 that we're recording. They are a player's guide and a DM's guide, essentially, for the beginners into the game. So I think next week's episode, you guys can kind of look forward to us running a little bit of a one-shot adventure, kind of walking through what an adventure would be like, just a small little snippet. And so that way you guys can kind of get an idea of what it's like to play D&D. I think we'll have a special guest on here, one of our players, Brett Debin, and also potentially Matt Heron, maybe someone else.
We'll see what happens.
No promises, but it should be a good time. We'll just do a little mini adventure and run you through it. So make sure you definitely come back for that.
Okay, so with that, we wish you fair weather and legendary adventures. Thanks for joining us, travelers.